Welcome to the Business Talk podcast. I'm your host Deepak from India. Today we are delighted to welcome Dr. Frank Leo, Associate Professor of Finance at the University of Western Australia Business School's Department of Accounting and Finance, and Research Affiliate at the Center for Economic History as our distinguished guest on the podcast. Dr. Frank's diverse research interest spans asset pricing, corporate finance, economic history, and private equity, reflecting his deep commitment to exploring the evolution and dynamics of modern financial systems. Dr. Leo's work has appeared in several leading academic and professional journals, including Business History, Economic History Review, Financial Analyst Journal, Journal of Corporate Finance, and Journal of Banking and Finance, among others. Since 2015, his excellence in teaching has been recognized through more than 15 awards, notably the 2019 Australian Awards for University Teaching Citation Award at the national level. He holds a PhD in finance from the University of Queensland, following dual bachelor's degree in actuarial studies and finance from the Australian National University. Beyond academia, Dr. Leo contributes to the financial industry as a member of the Faculty Advisory Board for Continuity Capital Partners Private Limited. In this episode, Dr. Frank Leo discusses his study, Divine Dividends, How Religious Traditions Shape Corporate Payout Policies, exploring how Buddhist and Taoist influences affect dividend behaviors among Chinese A-share firms. His findings reveal that stronger religious traditions enhance dividend payouts, corporate responsibility, and investor trust, illustrating the powerful role of informal institutions in financial decision-making. Let's not keep you waiting. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Frank Leo to the conversation. Dr. Frank, we are deeply honored by your presence and grateful for your time with us today.
Thank you very much for the introduction. And of course, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Professor, what inspired you and your team to explore the intersection between religious traditions and corporate dividend policies, two areas that are rarely studied together?
Well, I just wanted to say it's a real pleasure to share this research with your audience. The idea actually started with a small moment in Shanghai, and I was walking out of a modern office tower, all glass and steel, and right across the street was Jingang Temple. Have you been there before, Deepak?
No, Professor.
Well, I mean, if you next time when you are in Shanghai, please definitely visit Jingang Temple. You won't miss it.
Sure.
It's a very old Buddhist temple with incense in the air. At one point, the temple bell rang, and it really made me pause. What struck me was the contrast. On one side, you had modern finance and corporate headquarters. On the other side, you had these very old religious traditions. So, as finance professors, we are usually trained to think about corporate decisions in very technical ways. So we talk about taxes, incentives, regulations, and corporate governance. But just standing there, I started wondering whether the cultural environment around companies might also shape what happens inside the boardroom. And interestingly, one of my long-term collaborators, Xu Xian, had a related experience. So when he was studying his PhD in his MBA in China, some of his classmates were actually monks and nuns. Imagine that, monks doing an MBA. Right. So through daily conversations with them, he started thinking about how religious values might interact with modern business decision making. So both of us had this idea and we're asking similar questions, but from different angles. Could religious traditions influence economic behavior in subtle ways? And that question led us to something quite specific in China's stock market. Because in China, investors often complain about companies that never pay dividends. In fact, there's even a nickname for them. They call them iron roosters. So the idea is that if they're so stingy, you can't even pluck even a single feather from them. So I decided to say, let's work with my co-authors, Xu Xian and Mengdi, and we studied this one carefully. And we collected data from more than 33,000 firm-year observations of Chinese listed companies. And then we're looking at whether companies located near Buddhist or Taoist temples behave differently. And the results were quite striking, as you say. Firms located in areas with stronger religious traditions, they were more likely to pay dividends. And when they do pay dividends, they tended to pay more.
Professor, how do you define the operationalized informal institutions within your study? And why are they particularly significant in transitional economics like China?
That is really where the idea of informal institutions comes in. So in economics, we often talk about two kinds of institutions. The first one is the formal institutions, and these are the things like laws, courts, regulations, and legal enforcement. And the second type is then the informal institutions. These are the social norms, values, and shared beliefs that influence how people behave, even when there is no formal rule telling them what to do so, right? And in many developed economies, the formal system works quite well. Investor protection laws are clear and enforcement is usually consistent. But in traditional economies like China, enforcement can sometimes be uneven, especially when it comes to protecting minority shareholders. That's where our interest comes in, right? And let me give you a simple example. Imagine a company that operating in a community where values like fairness and reciprocity are strongly emphasized. So even if the law does not strictly force managers to share profit, they may still feel social pressure to behave responsibly, right? And in China, you often see this in subtle ways. Many business leaders support local temples, community charities, or culture events, and they would donate to have their names on because their reputation in the community really matters. So if a firm is known for treating investors unfairly, that reputation can spread quickly. And in that sense, culture norms can act as a kind of soft governance mechanism. So what we wanted to do to test in our research was to see whether these culture norms actually influence corporate behavior. Or in other words, even when formal enforcement is imperfect, the surrounding moral environment might still encourage managers to treat shareholders more fairly, including being more willing to pay dividends. Because as we know, paying dividends is not compulsory for a listed company.
Professor, can you elaborate on how the spatial distribution of Buddhist and Taoist influence across Chinese regions was measured and linked to firm level financial behavior?
That was actually one of the most challenging parts of this project because religion is not something you can easily measure in corporate finance data, right? You can't just open up a financial database or go to their balance sheet to say, here's a column that says religiosity, right? So we had to find a practical way to capture it or to proxy it. And what we did was looking at something observable, right? The geographic distribution of Buddhist and Taoist temples across China. Just like the very first moment I had with the idea that on one side was a temple, on the other side was the corporate headquarters, right? So we collected data from official registries of recognized religious institutions and mapped their locations across the country. Then we linked those locations to the headquarters of listed companies because listed companies are the one that we're more likely to get data. So you can imagine putting a company on a map and then drawing a circle around it. So for each company, we counted how many temples were located within their area. Our key measure, now we come to the research side of things. Our key measure uses a 200 kilometers radius, which gives a reasonable picture of the local religious environment surrounding the firm. So in a sense, temples become a way to measure the cultural environment surrounding a firm. We then combine that information with financial data from all these firm year observations that we were looking at between 2009 and 2023. And of course, we also wanted to make sure that the results were not driven by just one way of measuring religion. So we then ran several alternative tests thanks to our referees during the publication process. So for example, we also looked at 100 kilometer, which is a smaller radius, and 300 kilometers distance. And we calculate temple density at the city and provisional levels as alternative measures. And what is interesting that is that the results stay very consistent across all these different definitions. And firms located in areas with stronger Buddhist and Taoist presence, they were more likely to pay dividends and then, as we know, tended to pay higher dividends as well.
Professor, your findings indicate that Buddhism exerts a stronger impact on dividend payouts behavior than Taoism. What doctrinal or ethical principles within Buddhism might explain this difference?
Yes, I mean, well, first of all, thank you for reading our papers carefully because that's exactly what we found. Both Buddhism and Taoism tend to discourage excessive accumulation of wealth, but they approach this idea in slightly different ways. In Buddhism, there's a very important concept called dhana, which means generosity or giving, right? In many Chinese temples, donating or giving is considered part of daily spiritual practice. We do it every month, right? The idea of sharing wealth can easily spill over into how people and the managers think about business and responsibility. So giving is considered as a virtuous act. It is believed to generate merit and positive karma. That's the whole spirit of the Buddhism. There's even a well-known Buddhist saying that if people truly understood the value of giving, they would not eat even their last meal without sharing it. So if those values shape the local culture, it becomes easier to see how they might influence business decisions. And managers operating in that environment may feel a stronger sense that success should be shared with others, including with shareholders. Taoism, on the other hand, also discourages greed, but the emphasis is a little different. Taoist philosophy focuses more on balance and harmony, and on the idea of Wu Wei, which means acting in a natural and non-forceful way. So both traditions encourage moderation, but Buddhism places a clearer moral emphasis on active generosity and giving. And that may help explain why we observe a stronger effect of Buddhism on dividend payouts in our data. And we were really happy when we find a result.
Professor, you mentioned that religious functions as an alternative governance mechanism in non-state owned enterprises. Could you unpack how religiously substitute for weaker formal governance structures?
Yes, that's what we find. We find the effect of religion is stronger in non-state-owned enterprises or privately held firms, but they are still listed. So because you may for your readers who listeners who care about China, in China, state-owned enterprises operate on a different system. Their dividend policies are often influenced by government oversight, regulations, and political agendas. Whereas on the other side, the non-state-owned enterprises are different. Managers usually have much more freedom to decide whether to distribute profits or keep them inside a company. And when the managers have more discretion, local cultural norms can become more influential. So our interpretation here is that religion can work as a kind of informal governance mechanism. In communities where values like fairness and reciprocity are stronger, managers may feel more social pressure to behave responsibly. So if that company treats, so that's, if you think about it, if a company leader is known in the community and regularly participates in local religious or charitable activities, their reputation becomes important. And if that company then treats investors unfairly or refuses to share profits, that reputation can be damaged, right? So even without strict legal enforcement, social expectation can still encourage managers to treat shareholders fairly and to share them through dividends, and particularly in the non-state-owned enterprises.
Professor, the study finds evidence that religiosity enhances corporate social responsibility and investor protection. What specific practices or policies within firms reflect this connection?
That's a really, really good question. If you think about it, dividend is one of the main outcome variable that we're trying to capture, but it's just only one part of corporate behavior. So we also wanted to see whether these cultural influences show up in other areas. And interestingly, we do see that pattern. So for example, firms located in more religious regions tend to perform better on the CSR measures. In practice, that means that they appear to pay more attention to stakeholders, to their employees, to their local communities, and to environmental responsibilities. And you sometimes see this in things like there are more community donations, there are better environmental practices, or even stronger commitment to employee welfare. But another important area is investor protection. In the Chinese market, minority shareholders sometimes face the risk that controlling shareholders may keep profits inside the company or divert resources instead of sharing with them, right? What we find is that in regions where religious traditions are stronger, this kind of opportunistic behavior appear to be less common. And our interpretation here is that the religious culture reinforces social expectations about fairness and responsibility. Managers may feel greater pressure to behave in ways that the local community sees as legitimate and fair. And one very visible way that fairness shows up is through dividend payment, which is that becomes our main measure of the outcome variable.
Professor, one of your intriguing results is that religiosity fosters dividend smoothing. Could you explain how religious influence might encourage financial stability and predictability in payouts?
Yes, that was actually one of the results we find quite interesting. So in finance, we often talk about something called dividend smoothing. So basically, it means companies that try to keep their dividends relatively stable over time. So instead of raising or cutting payouts sharply from year to year, firms tend to adjust dividends gradually. Okay, so why does that matter? Well, because stability sends a signal to investors. It tells shareholders and potential investors that the company is reliable and thinking about for the long term rather than just short term. So, and in fact, investors generally dislike sudden dividend cuts because they can signal financial problems or uncertainty. So, and what we find here is that firms located in more religious regions are more likely to follow this kind of stable payout pattern. And one possible explanation relates to cultural values. So, traditions such as Buddhism and Taoism and Confucianism place a strong emphasis on long-term relationship, trustworthiness, and maintaining harmony. And when those values are stronger in the surrounding community, managers may feel a stronger expectation to maintain stable and predictable relationship with investors through this predictable cash flow. And the influence of the culture is not only about whether firms pay dividends, it also seems to affect how consistently they do so.
Professor, given your findings, what lessons should policymakers and regulators draw about fostering ethical or cultural norms as a tool for enhancing corporate governance?
Okay, being a researcher, we're writing papers to inform potential readers that including other academics, but hopefully we can make an impact on the regulators. And one important takeaway from our research is that corporate governance is not shaped only by laws and regulations. Those are obviously very important, right? Don't get me wrong, but culture also plays a role. I sometimes explain it in this way to my students, right? Regulation is like the hardware of governance, while the culture is the software. So for the system to work well, you need both to function together. And what our finding here suggests is that the ethical norms embedded in local culture can reinforce formal institutions. So when values such as fairness and responsibility are widely shared, managers may feel stronger social expectations to treat investors properly. And of course, this does not mean there's a replacement mechanism that religion or culture should replace regulation. Strong legal systems remain essential, But what it does suggest is that formal rules tend to work better when they are supported by compatible social norms. So for policymakers, strengthening governance may involve not only improving regulation, but also encouraging broader norms of ethical business conduct and corporate responsibility.
Professor, the paper mentions instrumental variable analysis and multiple robustness checks. What were the key challenges in ensuring that the observed religions effect were not driven by unobserved local economic factors?
Well, that really is the million-dollar question in empirical economics, right? We need to please the reviewers, but we also want to make sure that our findings are not driven by some other potential factors that have already been explained in the literature. So whenever we observe relationship in the data, we have to ask whether it reflects a true causal effect, causality, or whether it is driven by other local factors. So, for example, regions with more temples might also differ in economic development, education levels, or financial market maturity, right? So we spend a lot of effort making sure that our results were not driven by those kind of factors. First, we control for a wide range of firm level and regional variables, including firm characteristics and financial performance, industry effects, and local economic conditions. And then we conduct many robustness checks thanks to our reviews using alternative ways of measuring religiosity that, I mentioned earlier, different state radius of, the density at a provincial level or the city level. And then we also went one step further and used what economists call an instrumental variable approach. And the idea is to find a factor that affects the historical distribution of religious institutions, which means we affect the one of the X variable, but should not directly influence modern corporate dividend policies, the Y variable. So in our study, we used two historical indicators. The first one is the number of 5A rated scenic sites in each province. And so many ancient temples received this designation because of their historical and cultural significance. So whenever the scenic is rated as 5A, you attract more tourists, of course. And these sites reflect long-standing religious heritage rather than modern corporate behavior. So which means that it shouldn't drive a decision of the managers to pay dividends or not, right? And the second indicator is the national recognition of temple as important cultural heritage site, such as those designated in the early 1980s. And those decisions were made decades before our sample period, so they cannot plausibly be related to the dividend policies of these listed companies today. And by using these historical variables, we can isolate the cultural influence of religion from other local economic factors. And we apply this IV method, the results remain very similar. And that gives us greater confidence that what we're observing is generally related to cultural influence rather than just regional economic differences. So here we're trying to establish the causality rather than just correlation.
Dr. Frank, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Looking beyond China, do you see potential or similar mechanism in other emerging markets where religions play a stronger social role? And how might future research expand this cross-cultural exploration?
That's a really, really interesting question. As researchers, we always hope that our findings can encourage others to explore similar questions in different contexts. So more broadly speaking, I think this research opens up a bigger conversation about the relationship between culture and capitalism. More than a century ago, the sociologist Max Weber argued that the Protestant ethnic helped shape the development of the Western capitalism as we know today. And more recent empirical studies have found that firms in regions with stronger Christian traditions often show lower risk-taking, more conservative accounting, and stronger corporate social responsibility. And what our study suggests is that the Eastern traditions, such as Buddhism and Taoism, may also influence economic behavior just through different moral ideas. But China is certainly not the only place where religion shapes economic life. For example, research on Islamic finance shows that the Sharia-compliant firms often demonstrate stronger commitments to corporate social responsibility regionally, right? So here, there was a lot of potential for cross-cultural comparisons. And future research could examine how different religious traditions, whether in India, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, or other regions, shape corporate behaviors through different ethical frameworks. So more broadly, I think the key point here is this. Companies are not just mechanical profit machines, right? They are run by people. And people are influenced by their values, their beliefs, and the culture around them. So if we want to fully understand how markets work, we also want to understand the cultural environment that shapes economic decision-making.
Professor Frank, thank you for sharing your time and insight with us today. Your research on how religious traditions shape corporate payout policies opens new conversations about the human dimensions of finance and the subtle influence of cultural values in business decision-making. It's been fascinating to understand how concepts from Buddhism and Taoism can translate into real corporate behaviors, enhancing governance, promoting ethical responsibilities, and fostering stability in financial practices. Your interdisciplinary lens truly deepens our appreciation of how institutions evolve beyond formal structures. We are grateful for your contribution to this dialogue, and I am sure our listeners will take away much to reflect upon regarding the intersection of faith, ethics, and corporate finance. Thank you once again, Professor, for joining us, and we look forward to engaging with your future research. Thank you.
Thank you very much again. It's been a great time.